These days on YouTube, it feels like no matter where you look, there are retrospectives everywhere. Revisiting X in 2024, this 10 years later, that 12 years later. And there's so much of this in the gaming sphere, but also in like movies and TV shows and books even. And the question is, why? What is it about revisiting pieces of media that people find so fascinating? Is it really about, say, a game itself, or much more about a reflection of past experiences, a shift of cultural standards, of industry standards, or could it be something else? Let us dive right into it and see why retrospectives are so captivating. Okay, I think games are a special case, first of all, because they can change over time, right? They can get more updates, more expansions, even like single-player games, right? They get a lot of updates. They might be completely different to play 5 years after launch. And you don't really have that too much with movies or books. Sure, a book might get another edit, it might be retranslated, it might be censored, shortened, cut down, whatever. A movie might get a new cut, or might also be censored for some reason. That's all possible, but I think games are much more volatile or much more prone to change over time. But still, I think what's fascinating here is, sure, for one, it could be interesting to look at games 4 years later, like say Cyberpunk. I haven't played it, but that game is probably night and day how it was in 2020 compared to how it is now, right? What I find personally much more fascinating about retrospective content is what it tells us about ourselves rather than the medium. Okay, let me zoom out a bit. There were a few media scholars, a man named Marcin among them, who perceived media as extensions of ourselves. You could extend that to the idea that media is a reflection of ourselves. I think everyone knows the everyday expression of pouring one's heart and soul into something, which is often said when you talk about some kind of artistic expression, like some piece of art or a book, whatever, in games as well. Pieces of media like these are obviously made by humans. So if media is also seen as a reflection of the people who made it, then looking back on these things is essentially a retrospective on the people and or culture who made it, their views, skills, tastes, etc. While people like McLuhan were much more interested in form of media than the content itself, I think these retrospectives on YouTube are much more interested in the content side. I mean, sure, some videos, I guess, do focus on older hardware for games, let's say, but that's not really the point usually. This idea of media as reflections of ourselves is very fitting for looking at why retrospectives are so captivating, and the form isn't really all that important here. Okay, so a friend of mine had a very hot take in an online friend group of mine, which is that games do not age. That seems very counterintuitive, I think, to many people, myself at first included, because we are so used to saying that, oh, this hasn't aged well, or this doesn't hold up, or even in German there's the expression that something has fallen out of its time, for lack of a better translation. And what all this implies is that the product itself, the game itself, or whatever, is the thing that is changed, or that isn't up to some kind of standard anymore, right? But the thing is about games and movies as well, is that these are digital things, right? And they don't age like, say, physical things do, like an instrument, like a guitar or something would age. Of course, games can change over time with updates, etc. Still, relatively, it stays the same. Especially considering that something physical doesn't have an endpoint where it stops aging as long as it exists. But a game does have a point where it stops getting updates and stops getting changes. And so I think what does change then isn't the thing itself necessarily, or that much, but our perception of it. It could be something subjective, like that, for example, we played a game as a kid and it doesn't have the same impact anymore today, or it could be something like that we played a game at a certain point in our life that really fit that point in our life but doesn't fit any other point in our lives, or any number of other reasons why our tastes may have changed. Secondly, it could be something like shift in like cultural or political values, even like on a collective basis, right? I think that's very common with movies, that old movies are looked at with a very critical lens, that the way they, like how they portray gender and racist stereotypes and all that. I don't want to get too much into that. The point here is that these values might change even when the medium itself stays the same. Lastly, they're also shifting industry standards, right? We think with games this is very common as well, that certain quality of life standards have been established over the years, certain design standards, conventions, and when you look at, say, a game that exists before those conventions were a thing, that is also maybe a point of retrospective content, to revisit it and see if it, how we feel about it. I think that's an important point, how we feel about it. That's what these retrospectives are about, right? Sure, it might to an extent be also about the thing itself, what its properties are, what its strengths and weaknesses are, but I think a huge part of what makes it so appealing to look at these retrospectives is what it tells us about ourselves. If we still like the game the same as we did a few years back, like now unclouded by perhaps hype, these retrospectives are always presented in a very objective way, like this game 5 years later, as if it's some objective look back at something, but it's always subjectively colored, right? It's always implicitly, at least, about how a person who makes that content feels about this now, both through personal experiences as well as shifting standards, shifting values, and a bunch of other reasons. Let me know in the comments down below if you can think of any other aspects that might underlie this kind of need for retrospective. I think in a way it's also what I'm doing with these second chance videos, right? If it's also revisiting something, right? To see if I can connect with it now when I didn't before. Retrospectives are definitely here to stay and will always have a place in a kind of conversation about games, movies, art, everything. It is, however, futile to look at something like this and argue about whether it objectively holds up or not, and realize that it's all subjective on an individual level and a collective level. We just have to be careful saying that something hasn't aged well. Retrospectives are never explicitly about change perception, but they always implicitly are, and arguably that's the interesting part and not necessarily the game itself. Alright, I think that's all I have to say on this topic for now. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. I will not speak on my upload schedule here, but I do hope that I will see you again next time. So, bye.